My name is Jonathan Brown. I'm a professor at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service, and I am a historian. I'm an Islamic intellectual historian, and I have written a number of books on hadith, interpretation in Islamic law, scripture and authority, and most recently a book on slavery in Islam. So when Muslims, from the beginning of their religious tradition, they learned their religion through the revelation that came from God, the Quran, and then from the Prophet Muhammad's explanation of that revelation and added teachings. So the Quran is the first foundational source of their religion, but then the precedent of the Prophet, or the teachings of the Prophet, which is called the Sunnah of the Prophet. The Sunnah of the Prophet is like the second source, which explains and adds to the Quranic revelation. And of course, like during the time of the Prophet, Muslims could just ask him questions about something they didn't understand. But after his death in 632, then they're left with kind of on their own devices to try and look to these original sources to understand how they should live as Muslims, what they should believe, what they can do, what they can't do. And that's kind of the position that Muslims remain in today, right? Which is they look back at their tradition and try they seek guidance in it. Now, the way that the Quran was written down and officially kind of promulgated within 20 years of the Prophet's death, and there's not really a lot of debate about the historical authenticity of it, even amongst Western scholars. Like there's not, the hadith, the Quran comes from the mid 7th century. It's from the time of the Prophet, and people debate its meaning, but they don't really debate the text itself, the existence of the text itself. The thing about the Sunnah of the Prophet, the precedent of the Prophet, is that it doesn't get written down in any authoritative form. In fact, it doesn't really get written down in any form at all for around 70 or 80 years after the death of the Prophet. And one of the ways that it's written down when it is through what's called hadith. Hadith are reports about things the Prophet said, things the Prophet did, things that were done around him. So a famous hadith would be something like all deeds are determined by their intentions, or the Prophet prohibited Muslims from buying and selling things that don't exist yet. So these are rulings or guidance that he gives in addition to the Quran, or explaining the Quran, or affirming the meaning of the Quran. Now the problem is that unlike the Quran, these aren't written down in any kind of very contained way, and so you have a lot of forgeries. So remember that in the first century of Islamic history, Muslims expand from the Arabian Peninsula to North Africa and Central Asia and everything like that. And suddenly you have all these, Christians and Jews and Buddhists and Zoroastrians and Persians and Africans and Byzantine people, and everybody's becoming Muslim. And you have civil wars amongst the Muslims and theological debates amongst legal debates. So anybody in any one of these disputes is just sitting there. The best way to kind of advance their cause is to say, oh, well, the Prophet said that I'm right and you're wrong. So Muslim scholars had to try and figure out how do you sort these forged hadiths from reliable ones. So there's different opinions amongst Muslim scholars on how you should do this. One school of thought says that you should look more at the content of the hadith. Does it agree with the Quran? Does it agree with reason? And does it agree with the kind of the established precedent of Muhammad? And then if it does, then you accept it. If you don't, then you reject it. Another school of thought said, that they were uncomfortable with that because it gives kind of human reason and our interpretation of things too much power, and that we really should accept that maybe the Prophet could tell us things that alter our understanding of reason or alter our understanding of the Quran. And so they focus more on looking at the transmission of these hadiths, and is it transmitted reliably? Was it widely transmitted? Was it corroborated? Or was it only narrated by a few people or people who are unreliable? So it's more like a transmission-based focus. Now, the hadith tradition ends up being extremely, extremely important for Muslims because most of the details of Islamic law and theology don't come from the Quran. They come from the Sunnah of the Prophet, and one of the main ways we know the Sunnah of the Prophet is through these hadiths.